this is the worst crisis that the relationship has faced over the last 2 decades of strategic partnership. It's not the worst ever crisis. The potential impact, the damaging impact this could have on the U.S.-India relationship, it's not that much of a surprise to me that in the end the president decided to follow through on his threat to impose this additional penalty. So if that war winds down, which I sadly don't think will happen for quite some time, that would certainly benefit India. Well, at least we have some clarity now. I mean, there'd been some uncertainty as to whether the president would follow through with the additional penalty, and if so, what it would be. Now we know. Um, Unfortunately, given just how the relationship has been developing in recent days, this new announcement is not all that surprising, and the president has also appeared very committed to following through with tariffs. And in that sense, despite the potential impact, the damaging impact this could have on the U.S.-India relationship, it's not that much of a surprise to me that in the end the president decided to follow through on his threat to impose this additional penalty.
So you mentioned about the damaging effect of these tariff. Where are the ties between India and US going? What do you see coming in future?
Well, yeah, I think that this is the worst crisis that the relationship has faced over the last 2 decades of strategic partnership. It's not the worst ever crisis the relationship has faced. I mean, you'll recall there were many dark days for the relationship during the Cold War era, and then, of course, after India formally became a nuclear state in the late 1990s and the sanctions kicked in. Those were not good times, but this is really a difficult moment. So the question is how to move forward. I would argue that there is potential for this relationship to be salvaged, not just because of the natural shared interests and the strategic convergences and all that, but this is a relationship that is multifaceted and has many different areas of cooperation that play out on parallel tracks and have the insulation to withstand shocks to the broader relationship. And here I would point to the fact that even during the last few weeks, when we've had such a difficult period in relations, there have been some significant achievements for the relationship. The two sides announced a development related to space cooperation. And then, of course, the U.S. also designated the Resistance Front as a terrorist group, which was a big boost to U.S.-India counterterrorism cooperation. So things can still happen. Good things can still come from this relationship, even in some of the darkest days. But I think that moving forward, there needs to be a confidence building measure. There needs to be something done that can lower the temperatures and ease tensions to a degree. And I think that one example of that would be for the two sides to come back to the negotiating table. The President Trump has never said that he is not willing to go back to talks. So if the two sides can come back and start talking again, that could be pretty significant right there. I would also look to later this year when there is a scheduled Quad Leaders Summit in India. Assuming that summit happens and assuming President Trump goes to India, that could be a confidence building measure that brings a boost to the relationship. But I think for me, one of the biggest questions moving forward is, are the two sides and the various leaders not named Trump able to work around the decisions and the messaging and the actions coming from the president himself? In other words, will the whims of the president, will the actions of President Trump hold the relationship hostage? If so, it could be difficult to move forward. But if you have senior officials at the State Department, the External Affairs Ministry, engaging on high levels, if there's a phone call between, say, Dr. Jaishankar and Marco Rubio in the coming days, that could be very helpful as well. I think that talking is important. That needs to happen. Even as bad as things are now, I don't think that anyone who's influential in power in Washington, including President Trump, wants to see this relationship collapse. You have a lot of genuine support for partnership with India, but I do think that officials in Washington underestimate just how much unease and unhappiness there is in New Delhi and across the wider Indian public about the state of the relationship. So I do think it's important that Washington recognizes that, and hopefully that might prompt it in due course to try to push for new engagement that can try to bring this relationship back to a better place.
Michael, I just want to understand what, according to you, went wrong in the past few months. We have seen negotiation going on, and both sides saying that there has been a progress, and a deal could be there could be a deal soon. What went wrong, and what is the repercussion of that? Because Trump has made several statements in the past few days. He had called Indian economy as dead economy, and several others. A very harsh statement, if I may say. What, according to you, went wrong?
Well, I think there's several factors at play here. One is that both sides overestimated their ability to get over to get across the finish line. I think that that India overestimated the ability for the two sides to get to a deal, even with India insisting on not making some of the concessions that the U.S. side was demanding, particularly in terms of easing protections in sensitive sectors like agriculture and dairy. That's one issue. I also think that the U.S. side overestimated the ability to get to a deal, um, given um, given India's position. I don't think that the U.S. side thought that India would hold its ground. I think that the U.S. side expected that eventually India would fold and it would make all the concessions that the U.S. side wanted it to. And that's clearly would not be a good read on India's negotiating style and on its interest, its economic interest, its national interest. But I think that's the issue right there. So it's true that talks were going very well for many months, and India got off to a head start in its talks with the U.S. And that, several months before the reciprocal tariffs were first announced, you had the U.S. and India pledged to begin talks, which they did. So things were going very well, but I think it really came down to that last set of concessions that India was not willing to make. That's where the problems came up. I would also argue the Russia factor looms large here. I believe that President Trump has become increasingly unhappy with Moscow and particularly Vladimir Putin for not heeding Trump's calls for Russia to stop fighting and agreeing to a ceasefire. And I think that President Trump wants to pressure Russia to agree to a ceasefire by um, try to pressure Russia's closest trade partners, including India, to back away from their trade relationships with Russia. And I think this is another reason why President Trump has been increasingly inclined to be pushing these tariffs on India. He really hopes that that'll prompt India to stop importing energy from Russia and that would hurt Russia and that would make Russia agree to a ceasefire. A lot of assumptions here that I think are very questionable. But that's the position I think that President Trump is taking. A final point I'll make here as to how things changed so quickly when it came to the trade talks. I would argue that perhaps the president feels aggrieved by how he has been treated by the Indian government. I do think that perhaps he is unhappy that India's government did not allow him to claim credit for his role in the India-Pakistan ceasefire. I also suspect he might not have taken well to the call that he had with Prime Minister Modi several weeks ago, a call that, according to the Indian readout, was quite long and entailed Prime Minister Modi speaking at length with President Trump to tell President Trump that many of President Trump's positions about the India-Pakistan conflict were wrong. I suspect that President Trump might not have liked that. So I think a combination of, essentially overestimating the trajectory of the trade talks during the final stage, the Russia factor, as well as the issue of President Trump's own sense of grievance that might have contributed to how things played out.
So, Michael, you mentioned about the Russia factor. We have seen that China is the biggest importer of energy uh, from Russia, and we have seen European Union is also importing energy. Uh, so, why not punishing China? Why is Trump not punishing China but targeting India right
I
now?
think this I think this comes back to the taking it personally issue that I mentioned before. China has not uh, stood out there and refused to let President Trump take credit for his role in the ceasefire. China has not had its leader have a long conversation with Trump on the phone and essentially dictate to him, well, what's right and what's wrong. These are things that happen with India. And so I think that that's why perhaps President Trump would reserve some of his greatest ire on the trade and tariff front for India and for the Indian government. Indeed, it's a double standard, it's hypocritical, whatever you want to say, but I do think that that might help explain why India, which is, has been such a close partner of the US, has been singled out for particularly harsh treatment by the US president.
So you must have seen the Indian statements also. They are standing, India is standing its ground. They are saying that we will take necessary actions. We are here to safeguard our national interest. How do you see the statements and what does they signify to you? Signify.
And I think that these statements coming from the External Affairs Ministry over the last few days, I think they're most important for a domestic audience in India. I mean, because clearly many in India are very unhappy about how India has been treated by President Trump, and they want to see their government respond with defiance and strength. And so in that sense, I think that these responses from the government, it's most important from a domestic political perspective. I don't think that these statements coming from the Indian government are going to change how President Trump goes about his thinking on the tariff front. And in fact, if anything, he might even become more provoked now following these strong statements from India. So I don't think we should read too much into that, but this gets back to an important issue that I mentioned before. You need to have the two sides talking to each other, as opposed to just issuing statements that are meant to be seen by a domestic audience. We have to get to that point. But I think that the Indian government, to its credit, has come out with statements that are facts based, and indeed, it's an important point to put out there that the EU and to somewhat of a lesser extent, the US have continued to import Russian products. And also, the Biden administration had appeared to sympathize with India's position that by importing Russian oil, cheap Russian oil below a price cap that actually stabilizes global energy markets. Of course, on that front, President Trump would say that he's not the Joe Biden administration. Things are different now, and he would probably cite, what's happening in Russia as well. But yeah, I do think in this day and age, facts should never be taken for granted. So, in that sense, the facts-based statements coming from India, pointing to the history of EU and US trade with Russia since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this is very important to put out there.
So, given the Trump erratic nature, I would call, uh, he's making statements as we go. What all options India have? How should they proceed? What kind of interaction should they have with the U.S. officials? What, according to you, are the options?
Well, I think there are options not just in terms of how India should approach the U.S., but beyond that. I think that India has been pursuing trade talks with the EU for quite some time, trying to reach a deal by the end of the year. I think in the immediate term, India needs to try to shield itself from the potentially damaging impacts that the tariffs could have. The first 25% tariff will be going into effect the next few days, and then the other one, the penalty for the Russian oil imports, is scheduled to go into effect I believe in about 2 weeks or so. So, or several weeks from now. So, in that sense, it needs to find access to more markets. It needs to increase its market access. And if it's able to get a deal with the EU, if it knows it's going to be getting a deal with the EU in the next few months, that would be a big help, for sure. But in terms of its approach to the US, it needs to find a way to create the incentive to get back to the negotiating table with the United States. And it may take a few days, but you need to start somewhere. They are very close, right? They were very close to getting a deal. And even though India might not be willing to make that final concession that the Trump administration had expected, perhaps there are other areas that they could look at. But you don't know until you start talking again. Finally, the point I would make here is that I think India now has one more reason among many to hope that the war in Ukraine, if it doesn't end, at least has a pause. Because I think that Trump would not go after India as much on the Russian oil imports thing if Russia were no longer fighting the war. He clearly wants the war to end. He wants to take credit for that. He's angry that Putin is not listening to him. So if that war winds down, which I sadly don't think will happen for quite some time, that would certainly benefit India. We know that Prime Minister Modi and other Indian officials over the last few years have sought to push Russia to stop fighting. Prime Minister Modi, of course, delivered that message directly and publicly to President Putin at a regional summit several years ago. So perhaps India now has a fresh incentive to try to press Russia to resort to diplomacy and talks to wind down the war. Of course, National Security Advisor Doval is in Russia, as I understand it. I'm not sure what they're going to be discussing, but again, if there's an opportunity to gently put out another push to India to try to Russia to wind down that war, that would certainly that would certainly be helpful to India if it's successful, which it has not been to this point.
So my last question is not about the trade, but we have seen the US has been pushing India forward just to counter China in Indo-Pacific region, and this has been the policy for the quite some time. Are you expecting any kind of shift there? Will China become more powerful going forward? Will they have a positive impact of this decline in the trade between India and US?
Well, China is one of the big winners to emerge from this U.S.-India trade war and this U.S.-India crisis. India had been showing a willingness to ease tensions with China for a number of months, going back to before Trump was reelected. But I think that if it's facing the prospect of 50% tariffs from the US, it's going to have a much stronger incentive to reach out to China anew and push for expanding what is already a pretty vibrant India-China commercial relationship. So I think that there could be more momentum in what appears to be this modest China-India détente, and that's what China wants. China wants to be able to invest more in Indian markets. China has been a key investor in some of the key industries in India, as you know, whether you're talking about the automobile industry and clean energy, various others. Um, and so there could be an opening here for India, pardon me, for China. Um, if the Quad if the Quad is impacted by this crisis, clearly a major victory for China, that would be. We don't know yet. That's why it's really important. A really key signpost is whether the Leaders Summit scheduled to happen in India later this year actually happens. If it doesn't happen, if it's postponed to next year, that would be the biggest blow to the Quad since it was resurrected during the first Trump administration. And that would clearly be a big win for China, which I think has long viewed the Quad as perhaps the most potent example of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy and the Indo-Pacific strategies of the Quad countries on the whole that China views as a threat.